back, everyone. Thanks for watching this video. I am so glad you're here. My name is Mariah, and this is the Momo Reads. I've updated the name of my channel to sound all little professional. Well, maybe not professional exactly, but to sound smarter, easier to remember. I don't know. The name has changed. I am now the Momo Reads. And in today's video, I'm going to tell you why you should read Redwall. Okay, let's get right into it. First off, what is Redwall? Well, Redwall is a series by a man named Brian Jakes. He published the first one in 1986, I believe. It mainly follows woodland creatures in an abbey called Redwall. Now, if you read the series, you might notice some slight discrepancies between the very early books, particularly Redwall, and the later books. In Redwall, it seems as if these are mice in a human-sized world. There is a hay cart mention. St. Ninian's Church appears to be a human-sized church, and the animals are animal-sized. They go and meet a farm cat who lives in a barn on a farm. The humans apparently were even mentioned in some earlier publications, but have been removed from later ones. Now, this is simply because Brian Jakes hadn't fully fleshed out his world at the time, and I love Brian Jakes for the fact that he admits that he doesn't try to brush it off or explain why things are slightly different in Redwall as opposed to the other books. It's simply the fact that he hadn't completely figured out the world. And according to one thing I read, he didn't even realize Redwall would ever get published. He didn't realize it was that good. And then as it began to publish, he began to flesh out the world a little bit more. So in the first books, there are a few things that are slightly different from later books. But in the later books, it mainly follows mice and squirrels and hedgehogs and moles and all those sort of woodland creatures in the Abbey of Redwall. Now, before we go any further, I want to tell you my favorite things in books. I was actually going to make a whole video dedicated to this, giving you my top favorite things that occur in books and then the best books to go for them. My cat is running around in case things wavered. She hit my light. I don't know if she hit the camera or not. But anyhow, my top favorite things to read about in books and then the books to go to for those things. My first favorite thing in books is great friendships, followed by journeys. I love journeys in books. I love quests. I eat it up. I also love food. If there's a food in a book, it's all for the better. And I even love riddles and music and poetry and that sort of thing in books if it's well done. If it's not well done, it's a little monotonous, but if it's well done, I love those things in books. And of course, medieval settings. A medieval setting, swords and daggers is always going to get me. So keep that in mind as I give you some more information about Redwall in general. Before I go on, words difficult sometimes, I should perhaps explain my cat again. She's playing with the jingle bell. I perhaps should explain why I'm doing this video on why you should read why you should read Redwall. So, the Netflix has gotten the rights to Redwall. They are making a Redwall movie. Apparently, it's not a TV show. It's supposed to be a movie. We'll see how that goes. And I wanted to do a sort of a reaction video encouraging you to read these very, very excellent books. So I've already mentioned what Redwall is. Well, what happens in Redwall? Redwall tends to be very formulaic, I think is the word. There are certain things that occur in most books, and it has patterns that it follows. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. That happens in any detective TV show that you watch. A crime has to be solved. It's very formulaic in that way. So the formula doesn't necessarily make it bad, and especially because Brian Jakes has a way of mixing in interesting characters and new concepts to make each story feel very good and unique. So in Redwall, there is generally a quest, which, I love quests. Most of the time in the series, an event will occur early in the books. Generally, it has to do with the vermin. The bad guys, will go more on them later. But sometimes it's not that. There's some sort of event that occurs which causes part of the characters that we've met, part of the main cast, you may say, to go off and do something outside of Redwall. They have to take a journey to somewhere to do something, maybe to locate an object, maybe to find a cure, maybe to meet up with a character, maybe to hunt down a character. A bunch of different reasons why they have to leave. And then there are the characters who stay at Redwall and their stories as well, and we get to see how these stories align and intertwine. And there are certain catalysts which often are aiding in getting the story set off. For example, the tapestry of Martin the Warrior. Okay, real quick. Martin the Warrior is a very important character in Redwall. He shows up early on in the books, and he's like kind of like their heroic figure. He's the figure that they follow. He's not a deity by any means, but he's a very important historical figure to them. I'm going to go see what my cat is eating. I'm glad I checked. She was eating a rubber band, probably not something that would have been good for her to digest. Anyhow, Martin the Warrior is a very important character to them, and they have a tapestry of Martin the Warrior, and it gets stolen a surprising number of times. Many times that is the quest to go find the tapestry of Martin the Warrior. A very significant item in Redwall is also the sword of Martin the Warrior. Now it's made very clear that this sword is not magical by any means, but it is a very good sword. And if memory serves, it was made by a Badger Lord of Salamandastron from a hunk of meteorite, so it's pretty unique as far as swords go as well, and it is often an important item in the story that helps move the plot along. Hello, future Mariah here, just jumping in to say I forgot something else very important that often helps to get the story going or move the plot along, and that is the spirit of Martin the Warrior. As I said, he is kind of their heroic, historical figure they look up to, but his spirit is also known to reside in Redwall, and he'll often help them in times of need, giving them guidance or direction either in dreams, or sometimes it appears that he actually appears to them, but then they always wake up. So whether he appears in reality or whether it's always a dream, I'm not sure, but the spirit of the Martin the Warrior is also a very important part of the story and a very important aspect in getting the plot moving along. Also, I know throughout this video I talk about Brian Jakes as if he is still alive. Unfortunately, he did pass away a number of years ago. I'm not sure why I kept on talking about him in the present tense, but he is no longer alive. And lastly, in the video where I talk about my favorite books, just know that I could talk way more on them and give more detail, but I was trying to make this video as short as possible. Here's my cat. Oh, there we go. There's my cat. Aspen, murmur. There she is. As always, thanks for watching, and now back to the main video. Another thing that frequently happens in the books are different riddles. There is often something at the Abbey itself that corresponds to whatever the characters in the journey need. And there are often riddles that tell you where those things are found. The Abbey of Redwall is quite a unique place as far as locations and stories go, because it's given to be this vast, huge, big abbey with all kinds of secrets behind it, and it seems like in every book they're discovering some sort of new thing at the Abbey. Now, I probably should have mentioned this at the start of the video when I was saying what is Redwall, but real quick, Redwall does span 22 books. They were not published in chronological order. They were published just as he wrote them, and then later on he released a list of, okay, this is the order that they happened, and a surprising number of the books happened before Redwall was even constructed, even the Abbey was constructed, and then several of them happened during the construction as well. In general, within these books, they are not sequential, as in, well, they are sequential, but usually the characters from one book don't lead over into the next book. I believe there's 2, perhaps 3 books that are back-to-back where the characters are close to the same age. Most of the rest of the time, if a character is in one book, in the next book, they are going to be either extremely old or not in the book at all. So the books rarely involve these same characters. My cat is having fun today. The books rarely involve the same characters, but let's talk about the characters in Redwall. So this is perhaps one possibly flaw of the book, but it depends on how you look at it. The characters in Redwall, particularly some of the animals like the hares and the otters and the shrews, all have extremely similar personalities. Now you could say, well, that's not very good writing because people and characters are different. Their personalities should be different. But we've got to remember, these aren't people. These are animals, and they're different species, and it would make sense that each would have, at least to me, that each would have different characteristics and qualities that usually went with that species. And again, these are generalizations. There are characters that break these particular character qualities that go with these different animals. The first creatures that I want to talk about are the hares. Now, there's kind of two different kinds of hares that show up in Redwall. They're the hares from Salamandastron and then the kind of the wandering hares. Both have similar personalities, but the hares from Salamandastron kind of are the main ones you think about. So, in the country of Mossflower, in the world of Redwall, there is a mountain called Salamandastron. It used to be a volcano, now it's a fortress. It's the fortress of the Badger Lord, and he has an army of hares, and they are so fun. They say things like, what, and give him blood and vinegar. I love the hares. They're usually very military esque and hilarious, and they're snarky, but like in this particularly, I don't know, it's a very particular kind of way in which they're snarky, and they're so much fun. They, in general, are very gluttonous, meaning they can eat a lot of food. But the great thing about the hares is even the tubby ones who kind of seem like they're fools because of how they talk and how much they eat, they're usually completely amazing fighters, incredibly loyal, incredibly kind, and they're just incredible creatures. The hares who are not Salamandastron hares follow almost all the same traits, except for they're not in the military, so they're usually a little bit less professional, less yes sir, no sir, stuff like that. The next characters I want to talk about are the otters, and Skipper Otter in particular. So, in the world of Redwall, the skipper of the otters is simply the leader of the otters, and they don't actually live at Redwall, but they're usually at there or at Redwall whenever the books take place. So, they don't technically live there, but usually when you're reading a Redwall book, the otters are there. And for the most part, Skipper of the Otters' personality is the same no matter what book you read. In most of the books, there is a skipper of the otters, there is a leader of the otters, and his name changes, but his personality, not really. I mean, Skipper is usually Skipper, but that's okay because I love the otters. They're very jovial, very friendly, very kind, and also fearsome fighters. The shrews are probably some of the more unique characters as far as personality. In a lot of books, otters are very jovial, and I guess I haven't read a lot of books with hares in them, so I don't know if they're usually like the hares in Redwall. But the shrews are fun. The shrews do not live at Redwall. They don't appear in every book, and even when they're at Redwall in the books, it's very clear that they're just visiting, unlike the otters, where it seems like they almost might actually live there. So the shrews are fun. They're called the Gaussum. They're the guerrilla union of shrews in Mossflower. They are creatures who live mostly on log boats. They go up and down the river Moss, that's their lifestyle, and they're very argumentative. Now, that appears stronger in some books than in others, but in all the books, the shrews do indeed like a good fight, particularly a good insult battle. Another really fun creature are the moles. Now, the moles are those creatures that I liked more when I listened to the audiobook because they have a particular way of speaking that can be a little bit hard to understand if you're reading it. And I was listening to an interview by Brian Jakes, and he was saying how he actually based the moles off of some country folk that he once met. He was lost. He was on a dirt road or a back road. I don't know if they have dirt roads, but he was on a back road and he saw two gentlemen sitting in rocking chairs somewhere. Anyhow, he asked these two gentlemen how to get to a certain place, and they responded just like the moles in his book, and that's where the moles inspiration for the moles came from. So I have an example for mole speech from you. So this is from the Bellmaker. Mariel exchanged a grin and a nod with Dandin before answering. We're with you. After what we saw today of those filthy rats, Dandin and I are game for anything that will rid the land of them and their evil kind. Brr, ain't that easy, Zers? Ferp, straight for shaking his head. You'm's only seen but a few Foxer followers ord. Girt boatloads of ye vermin come to this land. More ye leaves in autumn in the wind. They be too a plenty for the loikes of us'uns to cope wi. So, the people who do the mole speak in the Redwall audiobooks do an amazing job of doing it as it's written, but making it easier to understand. That is the slight flaw in the moles, but once you get to be reading the books enough that you understand their speech, it goes from a flaw to one of the true delights of the books. Now let's talk about the badgers in the world of Redwall. I mentioned earlier that the badger lord usually rules Salamandastron. There has been a badger lady ruling at Salamandastron in one of the books. Badgers are typically mighty warrior beasts. They also usually are generally very wise, but they have a slight weakness when it comes to fighting because sometimes all of their wisdom just goes out the window because they want to fight. They have a thing called the blood wrath where their eyes turn red and they can't think of anything else, they can't see anything else. They just want to fight the vermin, fight the bad guys, and they'll do that until they die. And so that's kind of a slight flaw, and they're great, amazing characters, but it's also really interesting because it gives these mighty, incredible beasts who are generally very wise a character flaw that makes them more interesting. Another thing about the badgers is generally there is a badger who lives at Redwall. She is known as the Badger Mum. She is a character who just simply lives at Redwall Abbey, lends a fighting paw and a bit of wisdom to the Abbey. Birds do appear in the series, and they usually can speak. The neat thing about the birds is they're the one characters who can be good or bad. There are both. There are birds who are good, as a matter of fact. In one of my favorite, or perhaps not favorite, but one in my nearly favorite books, one of the main characters is a bird. He's a hawk who's a really good character. But there are other instances where the birds are bad, and there are instances where the birds are like, kind of good, kind of bad. Captain Snow in Redwall is kind of that character. He'll eat ya, but then when he realizes that you're friends with somebody he knows, he decides not to eat you this time, but he'll eat you next time. That sort of thing. Now, the vermin in Redwall include rats and stoats and weasels and foxes. And when Brian Jakes, I was listening to an interview by Brian Jakes, and the reason he made these characters the bad guys is he said, you know, if you call somebody you rat or you weasel, you know immediately what you're talking about. You know immediately that you're talking, it's something bad. And to me, this is the one thing that I can see being a slight, not a flaw, but something I don't like quite as much in Redwall is that it's good and it's bad, and there's hardly ever crossover. There are two characters who are vermin who could be considered good in the 21 books that I've read. So there is a character who is pretty much bad and does one heroic thing at the end, and then there's a character who's really just kind of too stupid to be bad, and he's kind of a sweetheart at the end. So in all of the 21 books that I've read, there are two characters who are vermin who are good, and then on the other side, there's at least one good beast who turns out to be kind of a bad murderer. But I think there are a few good beasts, like the woodland creatures, who turned out to be bad, as opposed to vermin who turned out to be good. Now, you might have noticed there that I said the 21 books that I've read, and I mentioned earlier there are 22. That's right. I haven't read the last book yet. The last book I got for Christmas a couple years ago, it's called The Rogue Crew, and I can't bring myself to read it. It's the last book from Brian Jakes. After I read that, I will have no more new Redwall in my life. I will have no more new Redwall characters to meet, to fall in love with. I need to read it. But I don't want to. But I need to. But I don't want to. I do the same thing with TV shows. I'll leave the last episode sometimes for a couple of years before I finish it. It's hard. Now, speaking of reading Redwall, there are more ways to enjoy it than just reading. And this is one of the very, very few books, perhaps the only one, where I could say that I personally think the better way to enjoy it is the audiobook. Now, someone once told me that Brian Jakes wrote these books specifically with the intention that they should be read out loud. I have never read the article about that myself, but I totally can see that when looking at the books. I can see their design and how they would be best enjoyed read out loud. And I think that the audiobooks of these are phenomenal. Okay, so in the audiobooks, if you get the right ones, there's a couple that are just them being read, but you can get the audiobooks where it's Brian Jakes himself, the man who wrote the books, reading the narrator bits, a full cast reading the characters' lines, as well as fully performed music. So Brian Jakes hired a guy who played the banjo to perform the music he wrote for Redwall. Redwall audiobooks are literally the best audiobooks I have ever listened to, no holds barred. And the really, really cool thing is that they're unabridged. So many times when you get a dramatized version of a book, it's abridged. And it's like, well, what's the point if it's abridged? But these aren't abridged, they're full, entire books, and it's so good. Trust me, go listen to them. Do it right now. I'll wait. Another good way to enjoy these stories is, believe it or not, through the TV show that has already been created. I'm creating this video in a response to the Netflix movie, but they did do a TV show, BBC, a couple years ago. Well, more than a couple now. Did a cartoon, and it's actually pretty good. The voice acting on the cartoon is phenomenal. The music is pretty good, and they do a pretty good job of following the storyline as well. It's not perfect. In Redwall, the first book, the first season is an adaptation of Redwall. They did take some liberties with the character of Matthias and gave him a bit of a past and whatnot, but it's still a very well done series. All right, now it's time for what my favorites were as a kid and how they have changed. As a kid, my favorite Redwall books were well, there's another one. Which one was that? Hang on a second. The Bellmaker. I'll be right back. Now on to Redwall favorites. What my favorite Redwall books were as a kid and how they have changed. These were my favorite Redwall books as a kid. The Bellmaker, Loamhedge, and Marl Fox, which is like one of the few books that does not have an audiobook to it, and I don't know why, because it was published long enough ago that it could have, but no, it doesn't. Okay. Anyhow, these were my favorite as a kid. What has changed since I grew up? Burp. Loamhedge is no longer a favorite, and now burp, Rackety Tam is, and also burp, the Sable Queen. Now, the Sable Queen was one I didn't read as a kid, so I think that's possibly why it wasn't my favorite. The interesting thing about them changing is a very good example of how good of an author Brian Jacques is. So, Loamhedge follows a couple different characters. It follows 3 characters who are teenagers, basically. They're called young beasts, but they're basically teenagers. As well as 2 characters who are a little bit older and who have been friends for a very long time. When I was a kid, I loved this book. I thought, yeah, why are people mistreating those teenagers? And yeah, they should be able to do that. And yeah, I'm on their side. Go. And then I read it as an adult. I'm like, oh my goodness, these teenagers are so annoying. Why do they want to do this? They should be listening to the grown-ups. They clearly don't know what's going on here. Which is actually an example of what a phenomenal author Brian Jacques is, that he understood both perspectives and could write both perspectives. But now, as an adult, this book frustrates me. So, it goes. Not my favorite anymore. And now this one. I don't really know why this wasn't my favorite as a kid. It has one of my favorite things, an amazing friendship. Like, oh my goodness, the friendship in this one is incredible. I think, though, the reason I didn't like it so much as a kid is because I have a little bit of dyslexia, and reading different accents can be very difficult for me, and the characters in this book have very strong Scottish accents. Now, as an adult, I've heard enough of a Scottish accent that when I read it, I know what they're saying and I can picture the Scottish accent in my head, plus I've heard the audiobook. But as a kid, it was more difficult for me to read, so I think that's kind of why I didn't like it quite as much. So here's an example of the Scottish accent that is written in Rackety Tam. Tam's eyes harden. Aye, they won't be able to repair it once we put torches to it, Doogie. So I couldn't. I know that my reading wasn't very good, but I couldn't catch the accent very well as a kid. This is another one of my favorites that's a favorite from a childhood and a favorite today, and I mentioned earlier that few books happen back to back, but this is one that does. Now, within the world of Redwall, time is referred to not in years, but in seasons, so I'll probably refer to time in seasons, and if you hear me do that, I'm not putting Redwall in TV show terms, but simply in the terms that Redwall used. This book happens a few seasons after Mariel of Redwall, and it involves a journey, it involves friendships, and it's just... It's perfect for me, and I really like it, and that is not a very good way of explaining it, but it's really good. Now, this one, I don't know why I love it so much. Actually, I do, but it's hard to explain. I don't know, but I loved this book. It has fantastic friendships in it. Now, in Loam Hedge and in Rackety Tam, the friendships were already established. They're kind of developed in this book. The three main characters who become friends throughout the course of the book, and it's just so good. And I am clearly not good at articulating why I love particular books, but I love it. It's great. It's amazing. You need to read it. This is my most recent read, I guess you could say, because it's the one of my favorites that I didn't read as a child. It wasn't out when I was a child. During my childhood, when I got to about when Doom White was published, Doom White is a book in Redwall, I didn't read that one. I started to read it, but I didn't finish it. That was just about the time when, for a number of years, I wasn't reading nearly as much, and so I didn't read this book until I was an adult, and it is really good. It again involves two best friends and their hairs, which makes it all the more amazing. And this one kind of takes a bit of a unique twist as far as Redwall goes, because although it does involve characters on a journey, they're on a journey from Salamandastron to Redwall, as opposed from Redwall to somewhere else. And there's a character in this book, the bad character, who is doing something particularly evil, and in a way that I hadn't ever seen an evil character do something in Redwall before. Okay, I feel like I'm beginning to ramble a little bit now. It's been about 30 minutes. So let's get into the real meat of the video, why you should read Redwall. The main reason that I think Redwall is a great book to read and a great book series is because of the themes in Redwall. They talk about and deal with so many things that people deal with in their everyday lives. Now, these books are aimed at kids. I think they're great for any age, but they're aimed at children without being talked down to. They write to kids without talking down to the kids. And they have themes like home. Redwall feels like such a wonderful place. All good creatures are always welcome at Redwall, and home is a very important thing in Redwall. Friendship is also a very big theme in Redwall. You know me that I love a good friendship, and friendship and loyalty and sacrifice are huge throughout the Redwall books. They are incredibly important to the books, and they're incredibly important to life as well. Grief is also explored in these books, and it's perhaps not explored as in depth as some would like. The characters grieve, but they don't necessarily go on chapters and chapters grieving. But there's death in these books, and it feels very realistic because sometimes the deaths are sudden, sometimes they're built up to, sometimes the deaths happen because of things that are out of the character's control, and sometimes the deaths are unnecessary. In this way, there is a book in which two characters go on a quest and they die on the quest, and it turns out their quest wasn't needed after all, and it's horrible and it's tragic, but it feels very realistic. And I love that this book is talking to children because they're kids' books, even though they're amazing and I think everybody should read them. They are written for children. But I love that these books are writing to kids and letting them know, hey, bad things are going to happen, but it's going to be okay. Now, I also love Redwall because they deal with the dark issues like death. They have slavery. They have all kinds of hard stuff that happen. But they're also wonderfully cheerful and wonderfully light. They're full of music and poems. Don't skip over the music and poetry in the Redwall books. It's some of their highlights. They're full of intelligent creatures. They're full of just wonderful food, which is so cool. And I really like something else about Redwall is that Brian Jakes, believe it or not, is one of the best writers of female characters I have ever come across. The female characters in Redwall can be amazing fighters. They can be really totally incredible characters who can fight and who are intelligent, and it doesn't delegate them to just simply the damsels in distress. As a matter of fact, usually they're incredibly intelligent, even if they are just perhaps a cook or a maid or something like that. I guess not a maid, but if they're just a character who lives at the Abbey, you never feel as if any characters are delegated as unintelligent or less intelligent than the others, whether they be male or female. Now, maybe you're saying to me, well, Mariah, I've already read all 22 Redwall books. I don't need to read them, but I want to read something like them. Well, you are in luck because I have a suggestion for you. The first one will come as no surprise. The Wind in the Willows. Brian Jakes himself, the author of the Redwall series, said that he really loved these books. I believe he read them as a child. Now, I read an introduction that Brian Jakes did for an annotated Wind in the Willows, and from that I gathered that he read them as a child, that he quite enjoyed them, and I'm pretty sure he found inspiration from them for Redwall. I believe that I read that somewhere, but I was recently researching and trying to find that notation, and I couldn't find it specifically anywhere, so I'm not 100% sure on that, but I am pretty sure that he found inspiration for his Redwall series from Wind in the Willows. Another great novel series to read, which are very similar to Redwall, are the Miss Mantle Chronicles. I can only suggest books 1 and 2 because I've only read books 1 and 2. They are not quite as engaging as Redwall, but they are still interesting. They're a different take on a very Redwall-esque setting. You know, they're woodland creatures who have swords and they fight, but it's a little bit different. Also, for one thing, in this book, the bad characters aren't necessarily going to be the vermin, so you might not know who the bad guys are the second they walk on stage. My next two suggestions are not novels at all, but graphic novels. The first one being Beyond the Western Deep. Both of the authors, the artist and the author, I believe, have said that they have taken inspiration from Redwall. I know they talk about Redwall. Whoops. Oh, things are falling out. I bought this book and it's got stickers in the front. I could put these stickers on my laptop. Anyhow, so I know that there has been some discussion about Redwall with the authors, the author who writes the story, and then the artist who draws the pictures as well. This book, or these graphic novels, follow two best friends. I know I have a thing for friendships. An otter and a squirrel, and basically they're trying to avoid war. Another great graphic novel for those of you who love Redwall would be the Mouse Guard books. These books have gorgeous illustrations. Just look at that. I don't know if you can see that, but these books are beautifully illustrated. These books are probably closer to If Mice Could Think and Talk, how it would really happen, because the mice are very mice-sized. The other animals are the regular size for their animals. Not everything isn't brought up to similar sizes as it is in many different books. These books are amazing and they're beautiful to read. There are two main graphic novels, the one that's fall and winter, and then there's a couple short novels as well, short graphic novels, and hopefully we're going to get a third full-length graphic novel coming out here pretty soon. And even more exciting, my shirt is Mouse Guard. So I got this in the mail yesterday and I really like it. My last suggestion for you, if you love Redwall and want more Redwall-ish content, is actually not going to be a novel or a graphic novel, but video games. There's a Redwall video game by Soma Games. I haven't fully completed it because I found out I'm not much of a video gamer. I bought my video game console, I bought the Redwall game, I was all excited, and it turns out I'm not a huge video gamer. But the Redwall game is quite fun, and there's also another game called Ghost of a Tale, which again involves a mouse and is very Redwall-esque. And lastly, believe it or not, there's another game you could play. There is a Mouse Guard role-playing game. That's actually how I discovered Mouse Guard, is I found the role-playing game, loved it, loved the illustrations, and from there found out that there's an entire graphic novel series. There was even gonna be a movie, but they canceled it. But anyhow, I hope you enjoyed this video. It's getting very long. I don't know if you can tell, but my voice is actually going and I'm beginning to go. So, I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks so much for watching. Like this video if you liked it. Throw a comment in there. Tell me something you think about something if you want to. And have a nice day. Bye.